The first set of remakes in the Pokemon series, Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, a pair of games that were originally planned during Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire's development, returning series creator Satoshi Tajiri to overlook the operation of not just remaking this old Game Boy map in the lush GBA palette, but as well as expanding upon it, bringing in entire new areas, compatibility with Gen 3 games, and packed with a new wireless adapter for wireless trade and battles. Despite being a remake, development still went through much changes and evolution. Everything from character designs evolving, entire cut maps, and many mechanics that never saw the light of day. So today on Cut Content, we shall explore the beta unused content of Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. If you enjoy this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. In remaking Generation 1, all characters were going to need a refreshed artwork to resemble the modern era and not so much the 90s art style. As such, artist Ken Sugimori redrew everything, including our protagonist Red. While receiving an overhauled design, he had actually gone through some revision initially, as found via some old beta sprites of him. The initial sprite made here had a design that much more resembled his Generation 1 design, complete with an open red jacket and black shirt, as opposed to the closed jacket of the final game. Although he was missing the white front part of his hat from Generation 1 to simply say that this was reusing that design, what's interesting is that a hatless version of this version of Red also existed, that had him with blue hair, which neither his Gen 1 black hair or Gen 3 brown hair versions resemble. Eventually, the model was updated to remove the hatless design and redrawn to have a more isometric design, but still mostly a similar style. What's interesting is that this version of Red turns his head, a feature no character has in the final game. While unknown exactly why, it might have been for an idea of moving diagonally, as code exists in the final game for the ability to do that actually. But alternatively, it seems a version of the head turn also exists for the final sprite. Now, when they got to Red's final model, his trainer art is of course based on the official art, but it seems they had his trainer art appear a lot more expressive and ready for action originally. Now moving on to Blue, all we have are beta sprites of him in black and white, but like Red, it appears it may have been also based off of his Generation 1 art, like he's wearing a long shirt like that one, unlike the final game with a shorter dress shirt. In fact, if we flip to his beta trainer art, it seems that is exactly the case, as he has his exact Generation 1 design here. Otherwise, his updated, more isometric sprite looks to share that same design before coming to his redesign for the final game. Now, Professor Oak initially appears to have had a different coloring scheme in mind, with pitch white hair rather than just being gray, and as well as a blue shirt and red pants. An odd coloring scheme. Eventually, he got the right colors as he should, but even then, he was still originally drawn differently in his in-game art, looking more toned, built. Clearly decided to jump the gun when going from a complete old man to a buff professor here, before meeting somewhere in the middle. Like with Red and Blue, he also had a beta overworld sprite too that wasn't so isometric, but otherwise, the design is in line. We also have one screenshot of him that shows him with that old coloring scheme that they were planning for him as well. Now regarding both our protagonists here, there are unused overworld sprites of them surfing. Unlike the final game, which has them surfing on a blob, this is a clear Lapras. Kinda like in Generation 2 when surfing. Would have been fitting since this was a Generation 1 Pokemon here, but I guess they didn't want it to look like a specific Pokemon. Now, before moving past the characters, an interesting tidbit is the internal names for both the male and female protagonists here. In the data, they each have what the team would label them as sort of a default. The male is appropriately labeled as Red as we know. The female, however, is labeled as Leaf. Now, this is pretty common knowledge that she is known as Leaf, but for years, that was how we even knew her name, from data mining. Granted, it was always strange why they called her Leaf here instead of Green, especially once in Pokemon Let's Go, they decided to call her Green, before Pokemon Masters made it more confusing by deciding to call her Leaf again. But of course, the world of Kanto was the grand piece to being rebuilt for this remake, in the lush palette that were just seen in Ruby and Sapphire. And it was done very faithfully at that. And they even went ahead and added an extra mini islands in the post-game called the Sevii Islands. The Sevii Islands consist of 7 locations. However, it seems several more were also made for these, and were going to serve more as routes to the existing islands. These being Sevii Islands 6, 7, 8, 9, 22, 23, and 24. What the numbering means here is that the routes at one point had a numbering system of their own, and this here is a relic of that time, unlike the final game that has its first route simply called Kindle Road. Sevii Islands 6 and 7 didn't have anything beyond a single tile, so there is nothing to show, but if one opens them up in a town map, it seems that they were to appear by 4 Island, which that in itself was a very simple island with no routes in the final game. In fact, Sevii Island 8 and 9 were also routes meant for 4 Island as well. Clearly was going to be a much heftier location initially. The good thing is that 8 and 9 actually have actual maps made for them, except there isn't much to see here. Both of them leading to dead ends, with 8 having a simple island that they probably were going to add a cave there, and 9 is absolutely barren, nothing made yet. Not sure how these would fit with the existing 4 island map, but maybe it had a rather different shape originally, or maybe there was a path through the mountain leading to these. Next up is Sevii Islands 22, 23, and 24. These were all meant to appear in 7 Island, and have complete maps too. 22 only has a coastline, while 23 and 24 have actual islands with caves that they probably were gonna let us enter. The neat part is that these routes all have entrances and exits, and based on the town map, all of them perfectly link up with the existing 7 island map. Clearly, they close off the sides once they decide to remove these routes, but I would presume, like those other islands in that route that wasn't removed from the final game, that these island entrances were also to appear on these cut routes. Aside from these, there is one other map here of a Soul Island. Its shape reflects that of Trainer Tower Island on 7 Island, so it can be speculated that this was an early version of that here while they were still designing it. But that is questionable in itself, as it is all sealed off by rocks. Now, to wrap up the mysteries of 7 Island and the Sevii Islands as a whole, there was a mysterious house here with an old woman in it that had a back exit with boxes in front of it. This was for a feature where one would use an e-reader with Mystery Gift, whereby the boxes would be moved to the side, and the old woman would allow you to go upstairs to face trainers, specifically the ones printed on the e-reader card. Of course, the set never released as the e-reader series was cancelled, a feature that was also to be used in Emerald actually. While the Sevii Islands were new, other touch-ups were being made to the remade map of Kanto, some of which was changed or cut for the final game. Firstly being this unused house interior that has data of it to appear in Route 6, 19, and 23. Now Route 6 has no normal houses, and Route 23 is literally the route after Victory Road, which has no houses either, but Route 19 is where it gets interesting. While the original games had no house on Route 19, Yellow however did, and let you play the Surfing Pikachu minigame. It's possible the house was being made for that purpose, but hard to say why it would appear in those other 2 routes, considering they weren't even water-based. Maybe they would have their own minigames for their own specific locations? As for the rest of Kanto, several graphical changes were made that never got used for the final game. For one, the Sea Gallop Ferries building was to feature a Rapidash logo originally. The Pokemon Mansion was going to have holes on its roof originally, showcasing its destroyed state further. I imagine they didn't want to bother with showing beams of light indoors for it. And remember that old Rhydon statue in gyms in Generation 1? Well, it seems that they did want to bring it back too, but was cut. Now, of course, you can't have a Pokemon Cut content video without talking about the Pokemon, though to a much lesser extent, since this is a remake of existing Pokemon. However, there are still a lot of neat tidbits. First, let's talk about these 6 Pokemon having unused world sprites. The presence of all these would usually mean that they were at one point planned to be faced in an event Pokemon battle of sorts and be catchable too. First, let's talk about Mew. Mew, of course, wasn't catchable in this game, but oddly enough, was an emerald, where on an island called Faraway Island, it gave you the opportunity to chase a Mew around and catch it. The island itself is said to be far away from Hoenn, and it won't even appear on your town map if you pop it open. My theory here is that they may have been planning this very event for this remake actually. Being that it is an island that would fit just fine with the Sevii Islands, and Mew being from Generation 1, it would have been the perfect opportunity. But alas, the deadline of releasing this game on the original game's launch date might have hampered such plans, and thus why this sprite might have been unused. Next up are the 3 legendary dogs. Yes, I'll say dogs. So in the game, you are able to find them randomly in the wild, with the specific dog you face depending on which starter you chose. However, maybe they were initially planning all 3 to have a set location to be faced in, or maybe we'd have seen a similar event like in Pokemon Gold and Silver, where they all run off on first contact. Celebi is another one, which of course wasn't catchable either. This event might have been dropped as they planned to let one get Celebi via the special Pokemon bonus disc that came with Pokemon Coliseum's Japanese version. Also note that the shiny Celebi sprite still exists in data too, despite it never being distributed to the public at the time. Then comes Deoxys' attack and defense forms. These forms normally exist depending on which version of the remakes you own, but when fought on Birth Island, he is always in his base form. But when he is caught, he turns either into his attack form in Fire Red, or defense form in Leaf Green, and of course speed form in Emerald. What these 2 sprites might mean is that one was to face them in an already transformed state in their respective versions. Some Pokemon also had slight differences too. For instance, Squirtle here had a different back sprite, where he was more upright. This sprite of Venonat being spikier originally. Now let's talk about the Altering Cave. The Altering Cave was a rather simple cave in these remakes, and also an emerald that featured nothing but Zubats. One would normally go in, see nothing of value, and leave. However, via Mystery Gift, there were supposed to be plant event distributions where the Pokemon that appear in the cave are altered out as the name goes. The Pokemon to have been altered out too would have included Mareep, Aipom, Pineco, Shuckle, Teddiursa, Houndour, Stantler, Shuckle, and Smeargle. All Generation 2 Pokemon. Alas, this event never happened, possibly due to how they all were already obtainable via Pokemon Coliseum and Gale of Darkness. I mean, why do this when you can sucker the completionist Pokemon player like yours truly to buy these games for these Pokemon? Now, when it comes to trainers, not too much extra is to be seen, but every trainer from Ruby and Sapphire exists in the data still, and can be battled. It is likely just a leftover from Ruby and Sapphire, rather than any grand plan to rebattle Archie from Team Aqua. Just like how every key item from Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire also appear here. But the one interesting bit here is the unused trainer class of the Pokemon Professor. Yes, Professor Oak was to be battled, just as he was also meant to be battled originally in Generation 1, but had to be cut. It seems they had once again planned to bring him back for real this time, potentially once more being the big super boss that he was supposed to be in the original games. Alas, that never happened. Again, might once more be for the problem of meeting that deadline, rather than make a full event around this true final boss again. Now, as we know, TMs in this game are color-coded to what type they belong to, such as water-type TMs being blue, but there was no TM for bug moves. However, they made a color-coded disc for that too, despite it not being used. It looks similar to Thunder's, but is a slightly different shade of yellow. Now to bring it home, literally, remember that old TV in your house in Generation 1 that if you go to the side it said, "Oops, wrong side"? This was something not seen in the remakes, since the TV is right against the wall. But if one clips into the wall and analyzes the TV from its sides, yep, that very message appears, as it faithfully should. It's quite possible that the TV was supposed to be originally more forward in order to let you do this, but with how cramped this version of the house is already, it likely couldn't stay that way. Through being a faithful recreation with many extras and charms added, Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen set a strong standard for how a Pokemon remake should be done. This all coming together with plans on balancing it between being either too similar or too different to the originals, or features that unfortunately just couldn't make it in for one reason or another. But even with what we got, this is still considered by the fandom as the optimal way to play the Kanto games now. This becoming a tradition for a long time that would see these remakes get even outdone with a remake of Generation 2 called Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Games I plan to cover eventually, so hit the subscribe button for I'll plan to be back with more Pokemon and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on which cut aspect you wish stayed. So everyone, thank you for watching!